Hi, I'm Maria Aroca, and today I'll be talking to you about my project titled Visualizing the Evolution of State Constitutions. State constitutions are particularly relevant to American lives, with many considering them to have even more impact over the daily lives of Americans relative to the federal government. Yet several surveys taken at different time points have found that half of respondents didn't know that their state had a constitution. In addition, many experts consider the US states as laboratories of democracy because while the federal constitution has only been amended 27 times, state constitutions experience constant transformation and are being amended constantly. However, there is relatively sparse research on the topic, mostly because of problems with data availability, as data on changes to constitutional text is highly decentralized. So with some exceptions, there's been less systematic research on the evolution of state constitutions. However, this all changed thanks to the data set that I'm going to present to you today. And what I want to do in this presentation is show you how some exploratory data analysis can use this novel data set to generate some research questions on constitutional change. So I'll tell a little bit about this data set. It was created by Miller et al. With information from all these different sources that they centralize and put together on a single data set. So this data set contains the original text of 111 constitutions. This data is at the section level, and it also contains all amendments that have been made to these constitutions between 1776 and 2020. They have completed data on 40 states, and that includes 19,000 sections as they were adopted in the original form, as well as 12,928 amendments to these documents. So I'll give you a little peek at the data set. Here we have the data set for Alabama 1901, and we can see that it has all of these different, it's at the section level, it has the section text as well as the section topic and the numbering, but their data set also contains data on amendments. In this case, these are all of the amendments that were performed on the 1901 Constitution, and it records whether this amendment deleted a section, whether it added a section, or whether it modified a section. And it also contains the text that the section was replaced with in case of that it was a modification. So it's a very complete data set. So my goal is to do a general exploration of this data and to create several visualizations that might give some insight into when, why, and how state constitutions change. So the idea is to use visualization to give me directions into which aspects might be interesting to explore. And I'll show you an example at the end of this presentation about how exploratory data visualization can help us identify interesting areas for research. So the first visualization I started with was I wanted to simply know how many constitutions and how many amendments to these constitutions had been produced by each of these states. So here you can see the total number of constitutions and the total number of amendments produced by each of the states. And in this case, I made a bidirectional bar chart that shows you both metrics simultaneously. And this I did because I wanted to be able to see if there was any relationship between these two metrics, but they don't seem to be very related. However, what is clear is that there is a lot of variation in terms of the amendments of the different states. So on one hand, we can see California with all of these amendments. And on the other hand, down here, we can see Illinois that has 4 constitutions adopted, but only 56 amendments across these 4 constitutions. So this is already giving us or suggesting that there might be interesting research avenues in terms of trying to understand why these states behave so differently. Secondly, I wanted to see how much change there is over time. Are the constitutions constantly being amended, or are there moments when the change happens more often? So I created the 6-year time intervals and decided to visualize this using a dot plot where each dot represents 25 constitutional sections that have been amended. So I found that because for certain years, the amount of amendments is so much higher. When I was using a regular line graph or a line plot, the visualization was really squishing around 0 in the y-axis. So that's why I thought the dot plot could give me a better understanding of the data. And yes, as can be seen by this visualization, there are several moments in time that appear to have a lot more amendment activities than others. The next thing I wanted to explore was how much of this change over time comes from section deletion, section modification, or section addition, and if these ways to transform the Constitution are used differently over time. So I decided to do an area graph where the deleted sections are represented in red, and I decided to make this a negative value so that you can see that it's something that's been taken away from the documents. The added sections are represented in green and the modifier represented in blue. And what is clear from this visualization is that we, at the moment in this current era, we're doing a lot more modifications and additions than we are deletions. And that it seems to be the case that modifications are the most used way to modify, or generally speaking, the most used way to modify the Constitution. So this suggests that we should pay attention to how these constitutions are changing and what it is that is being modified. However, obviously, these trends could be exclusively driven by one or a few states that might not represent the entirety of the states. So for this reason, I decided to map the number of modified, added, and deleted sections by state on these maps. And as you can see, it is true that some of these trends might be driven by a few states. So in this case, for instance, California, it has a very unusual number of deleted sections. Alabama has a very high number of added sections. However, it is clear that the modification is the most commonly or the most used way to modify the constitutions across the states, and that the deletions are much less common when we look at it at the state level. To explore a little bit more the potential problem that these outliers could create, I made a scatter plot, and of course I also made this in Altair so that I could see it in an interactive way to explore. And in fact, there are some outlier observations that could be driving those trends over time. So this suggests that any aggregation over time or any aggregation across the states needs to be done and interpreted very carefully, as they might not reflect the overall trends in the data set when these outliers are present in the data. Finally, as a part of the general analysis, I wanted to see whether new additions to the Constitution tended to remain on a similar proportion over time in terms of their topic. So what I did was that I created a radial chart to do this, because I wanted to compare these different categories across time periods. And as you can see, not only are the amount of additions that are done varying across the different time eras, but also the topics in which the additions are being done. So it's very interesting to see that in this era, for instance, there's a lot of judicial changes that happen. So these very generalized visualizations already suggested some very interesting avenues for research. But as an example, I just want to focus on one specific question that I'll show to you in the following slide. So in this visualization that I showed you previously, you can see here that there's like a little bit of an increase in the number of modifications that are happening, whereas before, in the period before, there were very few modifications in general. So I just wanted to explore this a little bit more closely. So what I did to do that is that because this data set contains all of the original sections and their amendments, it allows us to create time series of constitutional change. And this lets us compare how any given constitution looks at time t and time t+1. So basically, we can kind of create snapshots of the constitutions over the different years and see how much they change from one year to the other. So this is what I did, and I calculated a lot of different metrics to compare the document as it looked in, let's say, 1860 to how it looked in 1861. And then I did that for all documents, calculated an average, and I was able to use these different metrics. So you can do all sorts of things like compare the difference in the number of sections, how many unique words were added, how much of it was retained, how much of it was new. And you can also do things like compare the semantic similarity of these two documents at time t and time t+1. So what's clear from this, and I wanted to do all these different metrics to be sure that my analysis wasn't being driven by a single metric, but all of them show that they're in between 1865 and 1870, there's a huge increase in constitutional change. So what's interesting is that this corresponds to the Reconstruction era, which is a period after the Civil War in which the Union states heavily modified the law of the slave states that lost the war. And just to check that this wasn't driven by any particular state, what I did was that there's this, because we have basically turned the data into a time series, we can use different metrics that help us compare similarity between two temporal sequences. And one of those metrics is dynamic time warping. And what that allows you to do is to get a measure of how two different time series compare to each other. And what I did to visualize this was that I created this a heat map where obviously I'm comparing every pair of states, and the bluer the color, that means that the more similar they are in their time series, or the lower the dynamic time warping distance is. So that means that they're a lot more similar. And what we can see here is that the slave states that seceded have a different pattern of constitutional change, especially when compared to the free states. So what that might suggest is that these states were changing at the same time, that it wasn't, there weren't changing independently from one another. There wasn't one single state driving this entire thing, but rather all these states were having very, very similar changes, or they were having changes at the same time with each other. So in conclusion, obviously, we have seen that there's a lot of variation in the degree to which constitution change across states and over time. And that by itself is very, very interesting. And for future research, we saw state level variation, like how difference at the state level could be driving all of this. But we also saw that potentially external shocks like civil war, like the Civil War, could be also driving this change. Finally, data visualization proved really useful to help us identify promising avenues for research and promising research questions in this area. Thank you.